My husband set his fork down mid-bite, looked at me across our kitchen table and said, "My sister deserves a room in your house. Not our house. Mine." He said it that way on purpose, or maybe he didn't even notice he'd said it, which honestly told me more than the sentence itself did. I didn't answer right away. I looked at him, really looked, the way you look at someone when you're trying to figure out if they understand what they just asked you, and then I smiled because I already knew something he didn't. "She can have the whole thing," I said. He laughed, relieved, like I'd finally come around to something he'd been pushing for weeks. "See, I told her you'd understand. She's going through a rough patch, Nadia. It's family." I let him have that laugh. I let him think he'd won something. What Grant didn't know, what he still didn't know, sitting there with barbecue sauce on his thumb, already texting his sister the good news, was that the house on Fenwick Court wasn't ours. It was mine. Mine alone. Purchased 18 months before I ever met him, closed on with money from a settlement I never fully explained to him and never planned to, titled solely in my name, a fact buried in paperwork he'd never once asked to see in the 4 years since we married. He thought we owned it together, because I let him believe that. I paid the mortgage from what he understood to be a joint account. I let him pick the paint colors. I let him tell people at barbecues that we built the deck last summer, when in reality I'd hired someone and he'd mostly supervised with a beer in his hand. I let him believe a lot of things, because for a long time, believing them made him easier to live with. My name is Nadia Calloway. I'm 36 years old. I live outside Charlotte, North Carolina, and I work as a contracts manager for a regional healthcare logistics company, a job that pays well and that I'm good at largely because I have an almost pathological attention to the fine print most people skip. Grant Whitfield, my husband, sells commercial HVAC systems and has, for most of our marriage, made slightly less than me and mentioned it slightly more than necessary. His sister, Paige, is 29, and by that point in our marriage had already been evicted twice, defaulted on a car loan Grant co-signed, and burned through 3 temporary stays with their parents in Gastonia. Grant loved her the uncomplicated way people love a sibling they've spent their whole life covering for. I understood that. I even respected it in the abstract. What I didn't respect was watching him offer up my house like it was a spare room in a hotel he managed. "When's she moving in?" I asked, still smiling, already doing math in my head that had nothing to do with square footage. "End of the month, if that works," he said. "She just needs somewhere stable for a while." "That's fine," I said. "Let her move in." Grant looked at me for a second like he expected a catch, some negotiation, at minimum a sigh. When none came, he relaxed completely, the way people do when they've braced for a fight and gotten a gift instead. He had no idea that 4 days earlier, I'd sat in a lawyer's office 2 towns over, not because I suspected this exact conversation was coming, but because a separate matter, one I hadn't told him about yet, one involving $14,000 missing from an account I thought only I could access, had already put me in the habit of protecting things quietly instead of loudly. I'd asked that attorney, almost as an afterthought at the end of the meeting, one simple question: if my name is the only one on the deed, and I never legally added my husband, what actually happens if I decide, at some point, that I want him gone? I hadn't been thinking about Paige when I asked it. I'd been thinking about the $14,000. But sitting across from Grant that night, watching him grin down at his phone, thumbs moving fast as he told his sister she could start packing, I understood that the answer to that question was about to become a lot more useful than I'd expected. "She can have the whole thing," I'd said, and I meant it, though not remotely in the way Grant heard it. I just hadn't decided yet whether the whole thing meant a room down the hall, or an empty house with new locks, and a husband who was about to learn exactly whose name was actually on the papers he'd never bothered to read. To understand why I said yes so easily, you have to understand what I'd already found 4 days earlier, and why I hadn't said a word to Grant about it yet. I discovered the missing $14,000 by accident, the way I discover most things, while doing something boring. I was reconciling our joint savings account, the one we used for home repairs and property taxes, checking it against a Home Depot receipt for a water heater, when I noticed the balance was almost $15,000 lower than it should have been. 3 withdrawals over 2 months, each just under the threshold that would have triggered a bank alert, each one made on a Tuesday, each one while I was at work. I didn't confront Grant immediately. I've learned, In 36 years, that confronting someone before you understand the full shape of what they've done just teaches them to hide better. So I watched the account for 4 more days before I did anything, and in those 4 days I learned 2 things. First, Grant had a Venmo history with Paige going back over a year that I'd simply never had reason to check. Rent. Just till Friday. Gas money. A recurring $400 transfer every month that he'd apparently been quietly boosting from our account whenever his own checking ran short, which according to his own text to her was often. Second, and this is the part that actually mattered, Grant had never once asked whose name was on the house. Not when we got engaged. Not when we moved in together. 6 months before the wedding, when I told him I'd already handled the paperwork, and he said, "Cool, you're the organized one," and never brought it up again. Not in 4 years of marriage, not during a single argument, not even the time his mother asked at Thanksgiving whether the house was in both your names, and he said, "Yeah, obviously," with total confidence about something he had never actually confirmed. I let that stand for years because early on, it felt like trust. I'd come out of a difficult first marriage. My ex-husband, Daniel, had spent our 4 years together treating every dollar I earned as partly his by default, and by the end of it I'd learned exactly how expensive it is to assume a marriage means shared everything unless you say otherwise. When Daniel and I divorced, the settlement from his business buyout, the one that let me buy Fenwick Court outright, cash, no mortgage cosigner, nothing, came with a hard-earned lesson I never planned to unlearn twice. Keep something that's fully, provably only yours. So when I met Grant a year later, warm and easy and uncomplicated in every way Daniel hadn't been, I let him move into a life I'd already quietly secured. I never lied to him, not exactly. I just never corrected an assumption that made him comfortable, because for a long time, his comfort felt like peace, and after Daniel, peace felt like something worth protecting at almost any cost. There were warning signs about Paige long before this. 2 years ago, Grant co-signed a $9,000 auto loan for her after her 3rd car got repossessed, without telling me until the first missed payment notice arrived at our house because he'd listed our address as backup contact. Last year, she stayed with us for 6 weeks after her 2nd eviction, ate through our groceries, left dishes for days at a time, and told me once, not unkindly, just factually, "Grant says you don't really mind." I minded. I just hadn't said so, because Grant would get that specific look, hurt, a little cornered, and tell me she was going through a lot, and I'd decide, every time, that the fight wasn't worth what it would cost us. What changed, 4 days before the dinner table conversation, wasn't Paige. It was opening that account and understanding, all at once, that Grant says you don't really mind wasn't an observation. It was something Grant had been actively telling her, probably for months, to make his own quiet withdrawals feel less like theft and more like generosity he was entitled to distribute on my behalf. So when he asked me to give his sister a room in our house and I said, "She can have the whole thing," I wasn't being generous. I was finally done letting Grant hand out things that were never his to give. Paige moved in on the last Saturday of the month with 2 suitcases, a duffel bag, and a cat carrier holding an orange tabby named Biscuit that nobody had mentioned to me beforehand. I helped carry boxes up to the guest room without complaint, and Grant kept catching my eye across the hallway like he was waiting for the moment to fall apart. It never did. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle him. I spent that first week watching, the same way I'd watched the account for 4 days before I said anything. I wasn't trying to catch Paige doing anything specific yet. I was trying to understand the actual architecture of how this family operated because I'd spent 4 years only seeing pieces of it, filtered through Grant's version of events. What I found, once I stopped filtering, was a pattern so consistent it was almost elegant in its dysfunction. Paige never asked Grant for help directly. She mentioned problems out loud, a car payment, a security deposit, a phone bill, in a tone specifically calibrated to sound like she wasn't asking for anything, and Grant, trained since childhood, would quietly solve it before she ever had to. Their mother, Linda, reinforced this constantly. I sat through a Sunday dinner in Gastonia that second week where Linda said, apropos of nothing, "Grant's always been the responsible one. It's just how it worked out with these two," while Paige stared at her plate and Grant nodded like he was accepting an award. I'd heard some version of that sentence before, actually, 18 months into our marriage, and hadn't thought much of it at the time. Linda had said, almost as a joke, "You got yourself a good provider, Nadia. Grant's always taken care of everybody." I remember laughing along with it. I understand now that it wasn't a compliment about Grant. It was an instruction about me, a quiet family expectation, passed sideways, that whatever Grant had would eventually become whatever Paige needed, and that a good wife simply didn't make that complicated. The second week Paige lived with us, I noticed she'd started using the house differently than a guest would. She reorganized the pantry to make more sense. She mentioned, in passing, that the guest bathroom should really have better lighting. She asked, casually, whether I'd mind if she used the home address to register her car, just for insurance purposes, temporarily, and Grant answered for me before I could. "Yeah, that's fine, right, babe?" Like my house had quietly become a shared resource he was now authorized to allocate. I said nothing. I wanted to see how far the assumption would travel before anyone thought to check it against reality. It traveled further than I expected. 3 weeks in, I came home to find Grant and Paige in the kitchen, a folder of paint swatches spread across my counter, discussing whether to repaint the guest room, since Paige is going to be here a while. Grant said the words, "a while," like they'd already discussed a timeline I hadn't been part of. "How long is a while?" I asked, keeping my voice easy. "We were thinking, maybe through the end of the year," Grant said, "just to get her back on her feet properly this time." Through the end of the year was 7 months away. Nobody had asked me. Nobody, apparently, had thought they needed to, because in 4 years of marriage, I had never once said no to anything involving Paige, and a person who never says no eventually stops being asked. That was the moment I noticed something I'd overlooked for 4 straight years, something so obvious in hindsight that it embarrassed me a little. Grant had never once, in any of these conversations, used the word ask. He said we were thinking. He said she needs. He said it's family. He never said, "Nadia, can we do this?" Because somewhere along the way, without either of us ever agreeing to it out loud, he'd stopped believing that was necessary. I picked up one of the paint swatches, a soft gray called Quiet Storm, and set it back down. "Let's hold off on paint," I said. "I want to think about how we're using the space." Grant frowned just slightly, the first real flicker of resistance he'd shown since the dinner table. "Think about it how?" "I'll let you know," I said, and went upstairs, already reaching for my phone to call the attorney back. The attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renata Vance who'd handled my divorce from Daniel years earlier, confirmed what I already suspected. Since Fenwick Court was purchased solely in my name, before the marriage with separate funds, and Grant had never been added to the deed, it remained my separate property under North Carolina law, regardless of who lived there or who believed otherwise. Grant had no ownership claim. Paige had no tenancy rights beyond what I chose to allow, since there was no lease, no agreement, nothing but a verbal arrangement built entirely on assumption. "You could ask her to leave tomorrow if you wanted to," Renata said. "The bigger question is what you actually want to happen with your marriage." That was the real question, and I didn't have an answer yet. So instead of acting immediately, I did what I do best. I documented. I started keeping a folder, bank statements showing the Venmo transfers to Paige, screenshots of the "we were thinking through the end of the year" conversation I wrote down that same night while it was fresh, copies of the deed, copies of Grant's texts to Paige that I found, uncomfortably easily, still logged into our shared iPad from a family photo backup he'd forgotten was linked. Those texts were where the situation stopped being about a spare room. Grant had told Paige, 6 weeks before the dinner table conversation, "Don't worry about asking Nadia directly, I'll handle her. She doesn't like conflict, she'll come around." And 2 weeks after that, "The house is basically mine too at this point, 4 years married, it doesn't matter whose name is on it." He'd said that to his sister with total confidence, about a legal fact he had never once bothered to verify. I set a boundary the following week, calmly, at dinner, the same table where this had all started. "I've been thinking about the timeline," I said. "I'm comfortable with Paige staying through the end of next month. After that, I need the guest room back." The reaction told me everything Renata's legal analysis couldn't. Grant's face went hard in a way I'd rarely seen. 6 weeks. Nadia, she just got settled. She's had a month, I said. I said yes to helping. I didn't say yes to indefinitely. Paige, from the doorway, she'd clearly been listening, said, "Wow. I mean, I knew you tolerated me. I didn't realize it was a countdown." It's not about tolerating you, I said. It's about this being my house, and me getting to decide how it's used. Grant's response was the one that finally, fully confirmed the pattern. It's our house. I live here. I pay for things here. You pay for things from an account I fund almost entirely, I said, and watched something flicker behind his eyes. A flash of recognition that I might actually know more than he'd assumed. He recovered fast. This is exactly why my family thinks you're cold sometimes. You know that? Paige needs help and you're doing math. That sentence, my family thinks you're cold, landed exactly the way it was designed to, the same sideways instruction Linda had planted 18 months earlier, dressed up now as an accusation instead of a compliment. I recognized the maneuver for what it was, because I'd finally stopped being inside it long enough to see its shape. Over the next 10 days, the pressure escalated in ways that felt coordinated, though I never confirmed whether it actually was. Linda called twice to remind me, family helps family. Grant's father sent a single stiff text, hope you'll do right by Paige. Paige herself started leaving passive-aggressive notes on the fridge about grocery contributions, despite paying nothing toward the household herself. Grant stopped sleeping in our bed for 4 nights, choosing the couch instead. A silent protest he clearly expected me to respond to. I didn't chase it. I kept documenting instead. The calls, the texts, a photo of the fridge notes, dated and saved. On the 11th day, I found something in that old iPad backup I hadn't been looking for. Buried in a folder of forwarded emails Grant had apparently synced without realizing. An email from 3 months before the dinner table conversation, from Grant to Paige, subject line, house stuff. The body of it was 4 sentences long. I read it twice to make sure I understood what it actually said. Top to a guy at work who does this for family sometimes. If something happens to Nadia and me, or if we ever split, might be smart to get you added as an occupant on record now, establishes some history. Don't mention it to her yet, just start keeping receipts for anything you pay toward the house, even small stuff. Paige hadn't paid a single dollar toward the house. Not one receipt existed. But the intention behind that email had nothing to do with receipts. Grant had been quietly trying to build a paper trail to give his sister a future claim on a house that had never belonged to either of them. I sat with that email for 2 days before I did anything, mostly because I needed to be sure I wasn't misreading it. I wasn't. Renata confirmed that while the plan was clumsy and would likely have failed legally, the intent was unmistakable. Grant had been laying groundwork, deliberately and secretly, to manufacture a claim on my separate property for his sister. I didn't confront him with anger. I confronted him with paperwork. I printed the email. I printed the texts. I laid them on the kitchen table on a Thursday night, next to the deed with my name, and only my name at the top of it. You told her not to mention it to me, I said. You told her to keep receipts for money she never spent. What was the actual plan, Grant? He didn't yell. He did something worse. He got quiet, which from Grant usually meant he was calculating rather than reflecting. It wasn't a plan against you. It was just being smart. Things happen. I wanted her protected. Protected from what? Me. From nothing happening to her if something happened to us, he said, which wasn't really an answer. This is my house, I said. It was my house before you knew me. You spent 4 years letting your family believe otherwise, and 6 weeks actively building a paper trail to make that belief look real. That's not protecting your sister. That's planning to take something from me. Paige, arms crossed in the doorway, said, God, you make it sound so cold when you say it like that. It is cold, I said. That's the part everyone keeps missing. It was cold when he did it. It's not cold when I notice. That night I moved my most important documents, the deed, my financial records, copies of everything in Renata's folder, into a safe deposit box, and the next morning, I changed the passcode on the smart lock, keeping Grant's fingerprint access intact but removing the guest code Paige had been using for a month without me ever officially granting it. 2 days later, I gave Paige a written notice, 30 days, drafted by Renata, formal and unambiguous. Grant told me I was punishing everyone for one email. I told him the email wasn't the problem. The email was just the first time I'd seen the plan in writing. Paige moved out 26 days later, back to her parents in Gastonia, furious, telling anyone who'd listened that I'd thrown a grieving family into the street over nothing. Grant moved out 4 days after that, once it became clear I wasn't reconsidering, taking a short-term lease near his office. We filed for divorce that winter. Because Fenwick Court was never marital property, it was never part of the settlement. Renata made sure of that early, cleanly, without a fight worth having, since there was nothing legally left to fight over. Grant asked me once, near the end, why I hadn't just told him no at the dinner table that first night. I told him the truth. I did tell him yes, exactly the way he'd earned it, assuming things were his to give away without asking. I still live at Fenwick Court. I repainted the guest room myself that spring, a warm clay color I picked without consulting anyone, because for the first time in years, there was no one left to consult. I turned it into an office. The paint swatch Grant and Paige once spread across my counter, quiet storm, sits in a drawer somewhere, and used, a small gray reminder of the exact night I stopped mistaking silence for peace. Linda hasn't called since the divorce finalized. Grant sends a birthday text some years, not others. Paige and I have not spoken. What I understand now, sitting on my own porch in a house that was always only ever mine, is that Grant never actually offered his sister a room. He offered her mine, because somewhere along the way, he'd stopped seeing the difference between what was his to give and what wasn't, and I let that go unquestioned for 4 years because correcting it, out loud, felt harder than simply letting it happen. The night he said she could have a room, and I said she could have the whole thing, I wasn't agreeing to lose my house. I was finally deciding to find out exactly who it still belonged to. If someone you love started giving away pieces of your life without ever once asking your permission, how long would you let it go on before you finally said the one word they never expected to hear? Tell me what you would have done in the comments.